Hello, Brad Shelke here at Conversations with Mormons. This is part 5 of Melting Meg's Heart. Meg's pride tricked her to not notice her big sin. What is her big sin? Sin is a common word in the New Testament. In the original Greek, it comes from an archery term that means to miss the mark. That archery illustration means that God created the moral world with a target, a mark we must aim for and hit. Paul in Romans 1 declares that all the truth, goodness, and righteousness of God are written in the human soul. This means that Meg and all of us intuitively know the target God wants us to hit. It also means that life is like an archery competition where every moment of our existence is about shooting arrows in some direction. The only question is, which direction will we aim and shoot? God has a good and simple way for us to hit His target. His way is for us to simply aim at His target. The problem is that there is a competition going on between God and Satan. God designed us to do good completely dependent on Him to do good through us. And Satan deceives us to try to do good completely through our own effort. He does this by distracting us from God's target with his counterfeit one. God's target has a special mark that Satan's counterfeit one misses. Meg missed God's mark because she was taught about the mark in a way that affirmed her pride instead of bypassing it. She was taught that you hit God's target through good behavior. That mindset is a symptom of her rebellion against dependence and is the fundamental principle of her fallen nature. In episode 33, I ended with Meg surprised at my declaration that she experienced self-condemnation because her expectations for herself were too low. My words seemed impossible to her as she thought certainly her expectations were way too high. She thought she missed the mark by being too strict, but I knew her problem was leniency. I spoke very slowly to get her pride out in the open for her to examine. I next worked my so-called magic to draw out Meg's intuitive understanding of God's good expectations for her behavior so she could see the contrast. With Meg's mouth open in surprise, I said, "Let's explore your expectations. How often would you encourage me to do evil to your friends?" She said, "Never." "How about to other people?" She replied that I should never do evil to anyone. I smiled and said slowly, "I'm sorry to pop your bubble, Meg, but I don't meet your expectations because I've done evil." She smiled and said she had too. "Do you have any friends who've never done evil?" She didn't. "Have you heard of anyone in history who never did evil?" Meg replied, "Not really." After a pause, she smiled and said, "Actually, Jesus never did." I added, "He's the only person who succeeded at being truly human and not doing evil." "So when you said I should never do evil, weren't you telling me I should be like Jesus?" Meg smiled as she declared I should, but she wasn't thinking about him. To make the point more personal, I said, "One student who forgot about Jesus said she should have brought Jesus into the conversation. Let's bring him in officially, Meg. How do you think I'm doing compared to Jesus?" She smiled and answered, "Not so well." To free Meg to be more vulnerable and honest, I said, "One quiet student told me that compared to Jesus Christ, I was a total failure." Then she laughed about it. Meg smiled. I said, "Why are you smiling about what she said?" Meg replied that she didn't know. I declared, "There's a reason you smiled. It's because there's a big surprise in measuring by Jesus." One Muslim grad student told me that if everyone measured themselves by moral flawlessness, then all wars would stop immediately because we all would know we're together in the same boat as failures. Unity and humility result from comparing ourselves to Jesus. Meg, while condemning yourself, were you measuring yourself by Jesus? She said she wasn't. Instead, she simply failed to live up to her own expectations. I smiled and declared, "God gave you the target to aim at of measuring by Jesus, by never doing evil. You knew that, but instead of measuring His way, you measured your way. So you rejected 2 of God's good expectations. No wonder you beat yourself up." Meg wasn't aiming at God's mark of moral flawlessness, which is found only in Jesus. Instead, she aimed at Satan's counterfeit target at some form of leniency. God always expects and requires flawlessness of Meg and all of us. Our pride hates God's mark as it gives God all the credit. To get credit, our pride has to point us to leniency, which is better known as self-righteousness. Next week, I'll share how hitting God's mark or measuring by Jesus would affect Meg. Until then, please join me in doing 2 things. First, as you read the scriptures, change the word sin to missing the mark of righteousness and see what happens to your understanding. Second, thank God for giving us Jesus in His flawlessness to be the mark for us to aim at. Welcome to the conversation.